What if I told you the world was built on something horrifying and almost no one is talking about it? To understand the world we live in today, we have to go back to where it all started. Let's explore the real story of the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade was a carefully structured system built for maximum profit. What started as a small-scale operation by Portuguese traders soon became industrialized. As Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands joined in, fueling the growing demand for forced labor in the New World, European merchants and investors built entire economies around the selling of human beings, ensuring that every stage of the process was designed for maximum profit. European ships lined the West African coast, their captains negotiating with local rulers and traders for human cargo. The constant demand for captives ignited warfare among African nations. Some leaders resisted, but others, trapped by economic and political pressures, were forced to participate. Villages were raided, families torn apart, and entire regions plunged into chaos. What had once been thriving communities were now battlegrounds, leaving scars that would reshape Africa's future for generations. How did European economies benefit from making slavery a global enterprise? Ships left their ports loaded with goods, weapons, textiles, alcohol, and trinkets, destined for African markets. These weren't random supplies, but carefully selected items, chosen to appeal to the rulers and traders controlling access to Africans. European manufacturers adjusted their production lines to meet the needs of the trade. More weapons meant more wars meant more prisoners meant more profits. Captured men, women, and children were forced onto the very ships that had arrived with goods, replacing barrels of rum with human bodies. Chained in groups, they were marched from the forts to the shore. European traders built massive fortresses along the coast, not just to store captives, but to protect their investments. These forts, like Elmina Castle in Ghana and Gorée Island in Senegal, became the last stop on African soil for millions. Behind their stone walls, people were held in dark, overcrowded dungeons, living in filth, waiting for a ship that would carry them across the Atlantic. This wasn't just a business for individual traders. European nations built their wealth on this system. Before we continue, I want to share a powerful moment in history. In 2013, President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama visited Gorée Island, home to the House of Slaves Museum, one of the most haunting reminders of the Atlantic slave trade. Narrated by Michelle Obama, this short clip captures the emotional weight of what millions endured. Let's watch.
Today we boarded a ferry to Gorée Island, which is just off the coast of Senegal. Now, for roughly 300 years until the mid-1840s, millions of men, women, and children from Africa were kidnapped from their homes and communities and brought to this island to be sold as slaves. Now, on the island, we saw cells where dozens of people were packed together for months on end. We saw the courtyard where they were forced to stand naked while buyers examined them, negotiated a price, and bought them as if they were nothing but property. And we saw what is known as the door of no return, the doorway through which these men and women and children passed on their way across the ocean to a life of slavery, a brutal journey many of us know as the Middle Passage. Now, standing there, I thought about the terror and grief these people must have felt as they took their last steps through that doorway, knowing they would never again see their families or their country. There is no way to undo what happened on Gorée Island and no way to erase the stain of slavery from our nation's past. But there is also no denying the course that history has taken since that time. Since then, We've seen so many brave men and women rise up against slavery and segregation and injustice and inequality of all kinds. People who came through this island could never have imagined how history would unfold. And they certainly could never have imagined that someone like me, a descendant of slaves, would come here and look back through that door of no return. Maybe in the end, that is an argument for hope, even in the face of the most unspeakable horrors. Because time and again, both in America and around the world, we have seen that cruelty and oppression are no match for people of conscience who commit themselves to the cause of freedom.
The House of Slaves is just one of many places that hold the painful echoes of the past. What you just saw is a reminder that this history is not distant. It still shapes the world we live in today. Now, let's continue as we uncover more about the impact of the Atlantic slave trade. Why was the Middle Passage pure horror? Imagine lying in complete darkness, the air thick with sweat and sickness, shackled to strangers, barely able to move, with only the sound of coughing, crying, and chains rattling in the distance. The stench of death clings to the air. The Middle Passage was not just a voyage, it was designed to break the human spirit. Shackled below the deck, Africans were crammed into spaces so tight they could barely move. Starvation and disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, smallpox, and malnutrition took their toll. Those who passed were discarded into the ocean like wasted cargo. Some Africans, seeing no escape, leaped overboard, choosing the ocean over bondage. Yet even then, they were not free. Traders fished them back out, punishing those who tried to defy their fate. These ships were not vessels of passage, but prisons on water. Hundreds of men, women, and children lay chained in their own waste, suffering in unbearable heat and darkness. Women were particularly vulnerable, forced to endure relentless abuse and exploitation at the hands of the crew. How did the triangular trade turn forced labor into global wealth? Once the Africans were secured, the ships turned westward toward the Americas, where an entirely different world awaited. They were marched off the ships like cargo, prodded, inspected, and sold to plantation owners eager to exploit their labor. Families were separated in an instant, never to see each other again. These plantations became the backbone of colonial economies. The sugarcane fields of the Caribbean, the cotton plantations of the American South, and the tobacco farms of Virginia all depended on a constant supply of enslaved labor. From sunrise to sundown, they toiled under horrible conditions. If someone collapsed from exhaustion or sickness, there was always another ship arriving, another African to take their place. The raw materials harvested through this forced labor were loaded onto ships bound for Europe, where they were processed into finished goods. Cotton was spun into textiles, sugar refined and sold, tobacco cured and packed for European markets. These goods, produced through suffering, fueled industrial expansion and solidified Europe's dominance in global trade. The triangular trade was a machine that turned human lives into commodities. This continuous cycle fueled economies and made fortunes for people who never worked on plantations but benefited from the suffering they created. Governments and financial institutions supported this system at every level. Financial institutions provided loans to merchants, ensuring that ships could be built and stocked. Companies profited by insuring the ships and even the captives themselves, treating them as mere cargo. Laws were written to protect slaveholders, securing their rights to property, and ensuring that the enslaved had no legal recourse, no way to challenge the conditions they endured. How did the Atlantic slave trade devastate Africa for generations? The Atlantic slave trade had a catastrophic impact on Africa. Entire communities were destroyed. Kingdoms collapsed under the pressure of constant warfare. The continent was left weakened, vulnerable to future exploitation by European colonial powers, and economies became dependent on the trade of human lives rather than agriculture or industry. The loss of millions of Africans, particularly young men, created generational damage that can still be felt today. With so many young people taken, the workforce that once supported thriving economies disappeared. Fields were left unplanted. Trades that had been passed down for centuries began to vanish. Communities that had once prospered were forced into cycles of dependency, reliant on European goods in exchange for more humans. The wealth that could have been used to build African empires was instead used to fuel the very trade that was destroying them. Even as the Atlantic slave trade ended, its effects remained. How did the enslaved resist their oppression? From the moment they were captured, resistance was a constant force. Some fought back during the brutal marches to the coast, refusing to be taken. Others tried to seize control of ships during the Middle Passage. These uprisings were met with extreme violence, but they proved one undeniable truth: they would never submit willingly. On the plantations, resistance took many forms. Some slowed their work or found ways to sabotage the system that sought to break them. Others ran, escaping into the wilderness to form hidden communities. The fight for freedom was not just waged with weapons. It was fought with words, with stories, with a refusal to be erased. Olaudah Equiano, an African who survived the Middle Passage and gained his freedom, became one of the most powerful voices against the Atlantic slave trade. His autobiography exposed the cruelty of the system to audiences across Europe, shaking the foundations of those who tried to justify the trade. By the late 18th century, abolitionist movements gained momentum. Freedmen, activists, and allies in Europe and the Americas pushed for change. Laws were challenged, protests erupted. The British Empire outlawed the slave trade in 1807, followed by other nations. But true freedom was still a long battle ahead. Even as slavery was abolished, systems of oppression took on new forms, ensuring that the struggle for justice would not end with the stroke of a pen. The trade may have ended, but its impact never did. The racial hierarchies it created were woven into the foundations of the societies that profited from it. Wealth built on enslaved labor remained in the hands of those who had benefited the most, while formerly enslaved people and their descendants were left to struggle against laws and policies designed to keep them at the bottom. The cultures, languages, and traditions of millions were scattered across continents, blending with local customs to create something new, yet always carrying the weight of what was lost. That's a wrap, history seekers. Here at Getting to Their Roots, we bring you the stories that matter. If you've ever wondered how a continent of thriving kingdoms was transformed into a landscape of colonial exploitation, you won't want to miss our next deep dive, How Europe Took Africa. Because understanding the past is the only way to navigate the present. Thanks for watching. Peace and love.